Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future Space. I'm your host, Daniel Fox. Our guest today is Daniel Leeb. Daniel is the founding partner and mission director at Iceland Space Agency. Daniel, welcome to the Future Space.
Daniel, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
It's an exciting time for Iceland. There's so many space things going on, and I can't wait to dig into it. But before we go there, could you share with us your 3 words that capture the essence of space for you?
3 words. That's difficult, Daniel. I just got back from the International Astronautical Congress, and if I was to describe the experience, I would say run-on sentence. So, in terms of 3 words, I think you'll have to come back to me for that.
All right, I'll make sure to get those 3 words by the end of this interview. So now there's a science story of going to space. Obviously, there's science knowledge. There's a lot of things. There's a technology story of going to space, all these innovations that will trickle down to Earth and propel us to these next destinations. But there's also a human story of going to space. What do you think for you is that human story?
Well, I think if we think about the image that has inspired so many generations since the dawn of the space age, which is Earthrise, which was captured famously by Bill Anders in Apollo 8. And we think about the story of how that image was captured. I think a lot of people know it was part of the Apollo mission prior to the moon landings on Apollo 8. As they came around the moon, they saw this beautiful blue marble rising from the heavens, which of course was our planet and showed the fragility of our own planet. But what very few people know is that Bill Anders actually started his journey here in Iceland when he was part of the original Apollo astronauts that came here to Iceland in 1965 and 1967 to conduct vital geological research in order to gain mission confidence for the eventual moon landings. And when I think about the human experience or the personal experience of space, really there's no better place to have that experience than here in Iceland. Many people talk about how otherworldly our country looks and feels. But what they don't know is that, in fact, Iceland has been there from the very beginning of space exploration, and that's because we have these terrestrial analogs, or areas here on Earth which have attributes similar to what can be found on other heavenly bodies, such as the Moon, Mars, and other planets and moons in our solar system. So that human experience that astronauts discuss when talking about the overview effect, or the perspective of seeing our own planet from above. That's also an experience that many people get here in Iceland when they see the magnitude and ferocity of nature and of our own environment and the extremes that exist here. So that kind of human experience of space is something in some ways that we touch on every day here in Iceland.
So would it be fair to say that if we're interested to visualize what a human colony or a society in outer space on a Jupiter moon, go first to Iceland and you'll get a good idea, because Iceland is probably the closest of what you can get out of space, but here on Earth?
Absolutely. And it's with that very fact that space agencies, NASA, the European Space Agency, and private space enterprise has been coming to Iceland since that dawn of the space era. And they do so because it doesn't just look and feel like this place, but the science that can be conducted here can in fact inform the future of space exploration.
I think Iceland needs to totally rebrand itself in this new era of space and just literally embrace this space direction and brand itself as like the outer space here on Earth and just go full on. And you, with the agency, just lead the way.
Yes. Well, we're doing our best. You know, the obviously a lot of people know about Iceland now through tourism because we had the biggest disruptive marketing campaign back in 2010 when Eyjafjallajökull erupted and stopped all air traffic going across the Atlantic. And since then, we've been on this kind of skyrocket for tourism. So a lot of people have been coming to our country, and that those numbers have been increasing. And that's also something that is important to build on, because there's an opportunity there as people come to experience nature, to experience these extremes. That's also a real opportunity to teach them about the fragility of our own planet and also the potential to reach for the stars right here in our own country.
I've always said that when I did my solo wilderness expeditions, for me, wilderness has always been an exercise of humility. You go out, and even though our species have become master in adapting and going beyond these limitations, you always feel humble and small in the grand scheme of nature, of life. And now it was on Earth, and we're about to get into space, and I think that humility will carry. It just changes the scale, because we might have kind of mastered most of the elements here on Earth, but now that we get to space, it's like starting from scratch and just dealing with now even bigger forces and bigger dynamics, and we will always have to accept the smallness. I mean, we play a big role in the propelling of life on Earth, but we're still just this insignificant piece of the puzzle. And when you get to Iceland, I just came back from Iceland. I spent some time over there, both by myself and with my wife, and you just feel the extremity of the landscape of nature. It's right in your face. Just that the landscape is so in your, like right there, these cliffs that are everywhere, waterfalls, glaciers, the blackness of the volcanic rocks. It is it's an inspiring, humble, like full of surprises landscape. And I mean, we'll get to your journey of like from New York to there, but I'm pretty sure that still to this day, it inspires you and makes you, like, it fills you with awe, right?
There's no question. I mean, whether it's watching a perpetual sunset where magic hour is hours, or whether it's going out on a ground truthing mission to see if we can capture the northern lights, or hiking up onto one of the glaciers with my partner Gunnar Gudjonsson and exploring a new ice cave. It doesn't get old. It's a boundless, awe-inspiring experience here in Iceland, and I'm certainly very humbled and privileged to call this country my home, and to be able to be out in the field with these incredible researchers who are exploring and also really providing new data sets and knowledge so that we can better understand our own planet while we reach for the stars.
Now, like you said earlier in the interview, you just recently came back from Paris, where there was the IAC conference. There was a lot of things going on, a lot of buzz, a lot of unveiling, and there was also it was a first for you and the Iceland Space Agency. Can you share more about that?
Absolutely. The 2 weeks, it was actually 2 weeks for me, that started on September 13th last month, where I got on an airplane to go to Turin, Italy, for the International Mars Exploration Working Group face-to-face meeting, which was with the heads of all the space programs, either currently running missions on the surface of Mars or planning future missions that will be going there over the next decade. And that meeting alone was just one of the most inspiring experiences of my career, to have this dialogue with these researchers and engineers who quite literally are doing the impossible, and so inspired to understand and hear the value that they see in our own country, in Iceland, in terms of how we can help and how our country can really provide further mission confidence before launch, or even inform the future of Mars sample return. And so that was Imaweg in Turin, Italy. And then I got on a train through the Alps and ended up in Paris for the International Astronautical Congress, where on that Saturday met with ministers from emerging space countries from all over the globe, and had discussions about lessons learned and experience, and how we can all collectively chart a path to the stars together. And then Sunday, where the Iceland Space Agency was formally voted as a member of the International Astronautical Federation, and then a week of again meeting with the heads of space agencies and CEOs of inspiring companies that are really doing things that just a few years ago we all would have thought we wouldn't live to see the day. And yet now these technologies and these missions are going out into space and really informing and helping us truly understand our own planet better. And I think that that's also one of the most important messages of these last 2 weeks, is that I think yourself and probably many of us who work in space hear this refrain of, we have so many problems here on Earth. Do we really need to focus on going to the moon or Mars? Aren't there enough things that we can focus on here? And of course, what they don't understand is that it's not an either or neither scenario, that in fact, so much of what we know about the issues we're dealing with climate change and global warming come from low Earth orbit. And many of the technologies that we're using to fight climate change come from space exploration. And so, I think that in terms of space and sustainability and, how we chart that path in a sustainable manner, that there's certainly conversations to be had. But overwhelmingly, I think being part of the global dialogue around space is also being part of the global dialogue about Earth and how we can conserve and protect our own planet.
I mean, that argument about why going, like, if you apply that to everything in life, there would be no richness. I mean, why go and listen to music? I mean, it's not really leading to any solutions per se. Why the arts? Why music? Why doing things that are not specifically about solving a solution? Einstein was famous about saying like, I need my walks in nature just because it creates the space for me to think and to go beyond. And I always tell people that back in the 1900s, when you had a lot of societal issues, there were some hygienes, there were some diseases, there were some problems to be solved. And yet you have Tesla, Edison, and the Wright brothers that are trying to power the world and try to take over the sky, and not necessarily, tackling some of the other issues, but the world that they created took care, really helped solve these issues. And, and it's the same thing about the space technology. No one is leaving Earth at the at the expense of the Earth, for the same reason that children, when they leave the family, well, I mean, you have different dynamics, but in general, children don't leave the family at the expense of their parents. They're leaving the nest so that they can start elevating, the family wealth, and what they do outside on their own comes back to the family. And that's when we look at some of the disparity between, certain culture. The family wealth is one of the big differences, the ones that are able to kind of elevate and continue and create this foundation, as opposed to the ones who just, they don't have this ability. And going to space is going to be that. Imagine these millions of people, these billions of people are going to be working and trying to find solutions. And that leap of technology that is demanded to go from here, to outer space is just going to propel to a new era of discoveries and innovations, that because the incentives are there, right? Here on Earth, we don't have the incentive to be efficient because of the abundance of resource. When we go to space, we have to be innovative and efficient, because that atom of transformed carbon that you have with you, you can't just like open the door and just throw it out. You have to figure out how to reuse it and be sustainable, self-sufficient in all this. And the sooner that we can mine off planet, the better it's going to be for for Earth. So, I mean, yeah.
Absolutely. And, I think that this is also, I think over the last 5 years or so, or perhaps in the last 10 years, the term ISRU, or in situ resource utilization, has become very popular in the space sector. But it's beginning to also be understood as something we need to account for here on Earth. And this is another place where Iceland can really provide expertise and know-how, as the environment here has been harsh and difficult since settlement, which is around 870 AD, and how the original settlers, the Vikings, learned how to live off this land, which was difficult to say the least, is also an example of how we may learn and better understand how to live in other extreme environments like the moon or Mars. And specifically with regards to energy production, with regards to growing produce, it's very difficult to grow produce here in Iceland. And so the innovations that have been taking place and that are taking place in terms of greenhouses and how you use the water better, how you use the soil more efficiently. These are all things that will provide knowledge for how we live on the moon and Mars. But ultimately, those technologies, those innovations that are being developed to very specifically grow produce on the moon and Mars can also inversely impact how we do so here on Earth more efficiently as well. And so I think it's a really important dialogue of how do we live a healthier, more efficient manner here on Earth, and how does that provide the data and knowledge for us to ultimately explore other worlds.
Now, I want to spend, obviously, a lot of time talking about all the work that you do in Iceland, but I'm also curious to hear your journey as someone who was born in Brooklyn, because it kind of, it illustrates also how we do things not exactly knowing how these places or these solutions that we're going to find. And, you started in Brooklyn, and now you're the director of the Iceland Space Agency. So share with us a little bit, like, connecting the dots between the beginning and where you are today.
Sure. So first off, I don't think I ever could have imagined that I'd be sitting here speaking to you as the executive director of the Iceland Space Agency, or having just gotten back from this journey with some of the most incredible minds exploring our universe, and having had the honor of been in dialogue with these experts in their fields. My journey my course has been anything but straight. And as you mentioned, I was born in Brooklyn, New York. And I was always fascinated with space and science. And I think my father helped to certainly nurture that love for science and technology. We had a subscription to Popular Science and Scientific America and Omni, and I used to read these voraciously. And my father used to share articles and knowledge with me. But he was also constantly telling us stories from all over the globe, and he would always read stories to my brother and I growing up. And I remember at one point he was reading some stories from Iceland, from the Poetic Eddas or the sagas, and it laid a little seed of, wow, this place sounds like a place I'd like to visit one day. And there was a mystery there, and there was kind of an otherworldly nature of this place I knew very little about. But while I was in grade school, I was also constantly spending time in this mock habitat. They built a habitat or a space station for an after-school program that was sponsored in part by NASA or informed by an early STEAM education initiative. And this was when I was in fourth grade. And I remember spending hours in this little like habitat, cardboard habitat that had a butterfly going through its metamorphosis, and it had microscopes, and it had a very early Atari computer, I believe, where we were learning how to code. And so it was just kind of an inspiration hub, right? And it was all based around space. My parents took my brother and I to the Air and Space Museum a number of times when we were growing up. I had a NASA flight jacket, but even with all this inspiration and all of these incredible nurturing moments, I went down a creative path. I ultimately went to art school. I went to the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, Rhode Island, and I focused on storytelling and interactive design. Even while I was there, I had a very brief internship at MIT because the technology side of things was what inspired me most. After I graduated, I moved back to New York. I had a film production company in New York City for almost 16 years. And all this time, I was also fortunately able to go to Iceland. And you know what? I'm going to stop there for 1 second because I forgot a very important part of this story. So I'm going to rewind there, Daniel, if that's all right.
Please, by all means, go ahead.
Yeah. So while I was in art school, I met a good friend who was half Icelandic, and we started discussing the potential of actually going to Iceland. And I was thinking about these stories that my father had told my brother and I. And I started doing all this research and talking about this trip to Iceland, to this northern country. And all of our friends decided they were going to go as well. And when it came time to get the tickets, I was the only person who couldn't go. And I said I was working on a junior degree project at the time. The truth is I just couldn't afford the tickets. And so everybody went without me. They came back with great stories and pictures, and I just kind of kicked the dirt. And eventually I graduated and moved back to New York. And I was actually making ends meet working as a bicycle messenger when I walked into an office and saw my friend Claudia, who also went to art school with us. And she said, "Dan, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm delivering a package, actually." And she said, "Well, so strange that you walk in the door like this, because I was just thinking about you, because part of my job, I hate part of my job, and I thought, well, you'd be really good at it because you're kind of OCD, a little neurotic, and really good with color. And I said, thank you. Great. So what's this job? And she said, well, I'm the creative director for this magazine, and part of my job is managing the magazine while it's on press. And I hate doing that part of my job. And so I thought, you'd be really good at this. So why don't you come with me? I'll show you what I do. And if it works out, we'll send you every 2 months. I said, okay, great. Where do we do this? And she said, Iceland. Didn't you always want to go to Iceland? And so starting in 2002, I was coming to Iceland every 2 months for about 3 years. And every time I came, I, loved the country more and more. And honestly, I felt from the very beginning, I think I'm going to move here one day. And 2 weeks became 3 months, became ultimately getting a work visa, and then I moved here permanently. And when I did, after many years working in film production and working in fairly extreme circumstances for film and photo productions, I started going to these locations here in Iceland and planning expeditions in these very difficult and hard to reach places, and spending more and more time in these areas that are also known as terrestrial analogs, and ultimately planning research expeditions and working with researchers to access these locations. And then I was fortunate enough to get an invitation to speak at STEC to talk about these terrestrial analogs of the moon, Mars, and other heavenly bodies. And then those researchers wanted to come to Iceland, and in fact they did 2 months after I gave this talk. And they said, okay, well, so who's the point person? Where can we organize, and connect the dots with the boots on the ground here? And much to my surprise, there was nothing. There was nothing set up here. So every time researchers came to Iceland, they were kind of starting over from scratch. And so we started by just providing the logistical assets and know-how of how to reach these locations. And then eventually that dialogue became research-based as well. And as we progressed with this, we realized that Iceland has a lot to offer, a lot more than just being a destination for everyone else. And now, certainly with a family here, my wife is Icelandic. My daughters are quarter elf, I guess, and it's really about future generations and how space research and exploration can also really provide a path for future generations, so that they can reach for the stars and also better understand our own country and the earth beneath our feet. So it's become much more than just a passion, and it's much more than a job. It's really a mission for Iceland and for future generations here to understand the value of our own country and how we can really be a leading partner in the future of space exploration.
Your agency is not only facilitating the research in Iceland, but you also are an active participant participating in the development and the research, not only on a lunar suit or a spacesuit, but also all the science and research that goes into, like you are doing it also, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in addition to facilitating dialogue with experts here in Iceland, with researchers from abroad, and providing the logistical and research support, we've also been working to craft and chart a path for domestic initiatives and technological innovation that really will inform future missions to the moon, Mars, and other bodies in our solar system. You mentioned the spacesuit simulator. One interesting connection with Rhode Island School of Design, which is where I went to school, is that that's also where Professor Michael Lai is a teacher of industrial design, and he has and has had a studio for the design of extreme architecture and extreme industrial design components that can be used in space. And that studio has had an ongoing relationship with NASA JSC. And it's through that he and his students were actually working on a spacesuit simulator. And this is not a pressurized spacesuit. It's not a spacesuit to be used actually on the moon or doing spacewalks. It's a spacesuit simulator designed to offer enough of the characteristics of what an astronaut in training or a geologist working on the moon or Mars would encounter when doing the research or doing the various activities during an EVA. So it's about how the spacesuit simulator informs how you operate, what tools you can use, the design of those tools, the design of those habitats, and mobility technology. So we started working with Professor Lai to test the MS-1 Moon Mars spacesuit simulator here in Iceland. It had been designed, but it didn't get any activity. It didn't actually end up being used until I called Professor Lai, and he said, "Yeah, let's do this." So we planned a research expedition, which was actually the first research expedition for the Iceland Space Agency in 2019, and it was also an Explorers Club flag expedition. And we went to Grímsvötn volcano, which is the most active volcano in Iceland, and it's in the center of the largest glacier in all of Europe, Vatnajökull Glacier, in order to test the MS-1 in the most remote and extreme environment here in Iceland. And over the course of that project and building on what we learned, we started developing the IMS MS-2 spacesuit simulator. IMS is our general initiative for research and development for the Iceland Space Agency, and it stands for Iceland Moon Mars Simulation Research and Development. And it's divided into a number of separate programs, one of which is IMS MS2, which is a new iteration of the MS-1 spacesuit simulator, which is based on some of the geometry from the Z2 planetary XEMU that was designed at NASA JSC, which is a Artemis generation or pre-Artemis generation spacesuit. So that's one of our projects. That's an Iceland Space Agency project. We've also been developing the IMS HAB-1 project, which is to develop the highest fidelity habitat and analog research facility for benchmarking technology and operational procedures destined for the moon and Mars. So that's IMS HAB-1. We've also been developing IMS LDS, which is Iceland Moon Mars Simulation Life Detection Strategies, which is a survey of all of our analogs. And this is being led by principal investigator, Dr. Angelica Engels, who's at the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. And we also have IMS ISRU, which is a collaboration of multiple companies and research institutes and universities. And then we also have a very important STEAM program, which is all about inspiring future generations here. And we're working very closely with the Ministry of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, who actually has space in their portfolio. They're the ones responsible for space here in Iceland, and that's a recent development. It's also a recent development that we signed an MOU with the University of Iceland to develop research opportunities and innovation opportunities domestically. And through all of these projects, obviously, we have close coordination and dialogue with researchers at NASA, European Space Agency, and with various private sector stakeholders.
Now, the Iceland Space Agency, I understand, is private. You started it. What has been the response of the Icelandic government in terms of seeing where it is going and understanding the position of Iceland and what Iceland can become? Has the government been kind of involved, like willing to sit at the table with you, or do you need a little bit of convincing?
Well, I think everybody needs a little bit of convincing in terms of when the Icelandic GDP. If we just look at that, right, it's the biggest sector, the biggest export sector. GDP is tourism now, and that recently leaped over fishing. And then we have energy production. We have fantastic innovations that have been developed around the creation of geothermal and hydroelectric energy here. Virtually no fossil fuels are burned here in Iceland for heat or electricity. It all comes from hydroelectric and geothermal. But space, why space? How space? Many Icelanders just recently are beginning to know about the history of space in their own country. The fact that the Apollo astronauts came here in 65 and 67, that's something that now recently is on the tip of everyone's tongue. But CNES, the French space agency, was also here in 1964, launching sounding rockets on the south coast of Iceland. And the Mars 2020 program, the Perseverance rover, had instruments and technology that was being tested here in Iceland as well prior to launch. And just recently, we were working for the last 2 years with Dr. Michael Thorpe, who's at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. And he's a Mars sample return scientist. And he's been doing research here in Iceland. We've been working very closely with his team to better understand how the processes here in Iceland, the groundwater, geothermal, ultimately create the opportunity for life to potentially exist on the surface of Mars. And that is informing, obviously, sampling strategy and sample return. So all of these things separately start to build a story around the value of Iceland. And being able to construct that story and sing that song at the right time is ultimately how you get the government and ultimately the public here in Iceland to understand that there's value and there's reason, there's purpose in investing and supporting a space program here in Iceland, that we don't just have to be a destination for everybody else. We can be an active participant. And by doing so, the economy benefits, future generations here benefit. New skilled workforces are created. And ultimately, through inspiration, we can also chart a path that creates a healthier and more sustainable existence here in our own country.
I mean, you have like little countries like Luxembourg who are leading the space narrative. You have now countries who have no history with space, but just see that this is where the future is going and creating their own space agency. And you have Iceland, who has a rich history with space, but also has so much to offer to that future, that you're sitting right at the nexus of like making Iceland, the one of the leaders in building that future, not only in offering what the country can offer, but just collectively the story of Iceland, the past and the present and the future. So this is amazing work that you're doing. Now, if people want to know more about the Iceland Space Agency, I know that they can go on your website. You're on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. It's pretty easy to reach out to you, correct?
Absolutely, it's pretty easy to reach out to us and to send us an email to our info at Iceland Space Agency .is, or even reach out to us on our socials as well. We try and be on top of it as much as possible. We don't necessarily have hundreds of people working here. Sometimes we're just five, and then sometimes on other projects we balloon up to 20, and that's changing. You know, that's also changing as the interest and understanding of the value that we bring, not only to domestic stakeholders, but also to interested parties abroad. So we're growing, and I think we're going to be growing very quickly. But that engagement, that initial point of contact, where somebody reaches out and says, "Hey, I've got a project, or I've got a rover, or I have a habitat or a spacesuit, or a new innovative greenhouse for growing produce. We would love to talk and potentially test and prove this technology in Iceland." Often, these discussions happen with, a random message on Instagram or through a catch-all email account. And there's really no one method of a dialogue beginning. And it's important to nurture and to support and be engaged. And so that's definitely something that's very important for me personally, and for our team, is to make sure that we're listening. Because to have a successful mission here in Iceland is ultimately about being a partner to those researchers, to those entrepreneurs, and making sure that we're charting a path that makes us a good partner for them. And although we're working on our own projects, nobody will be going to the moon or Mars by themselves. This is a collaborative effort. This is about team. This is about the community of spacefaring nations and new spacefaring nations. And there's no one way to do it, but the one thing that's central is being a good listener, and being a good and active and engaged partner. And that is ultimately one of the most important things for any collaboration, really, but especially for space, when there are lives on the line, and ultimately large investments put out there. You have to make sure that what you're doing here is ultimately going to provide a return, and is going to do so safely and provide as much science on the back end as possible, and to do so obviously in a sustainable fashion.
Now, before I let you go, I want to circle back to the beginning, and you kind of lay out almost like saying it in metaphors, but what would be your 3 words that capture the essence of space after this conversation?
That capture the essence of space:
Yes.
exploration, sustainability, and inspiration.
There we go. Daniel, it was a pleasure having you. I cannot wait to go back to Iceland. I'm planning that for 2023. It's for many reasons, and I think you and I we're going to be talking about future collaborations. But I think that there's beyond the excitement and the movement that's going on right now within the space and within the future. I think there's something really special on in Iceland, and anything that we can do to promote, to elevate it, to really to kind of, because it takes more than just one person or one group. Like, it's a combination of all these different players that helps. And sometimes you have great initiatives, great players, but then there's just like, there's one part of the puzzle that's not working, and then it goes somewhere else. So anything that we can do to help Iceland and your organization to become a leader, we'll do it. You got my word. So Daniel, thank you again.
Thank you. A pleasure, and looking forward to seeing you here in the North Country, Daniel.
Absolutely.
And one last thing, Frá Íslandi upp í heimgeim, which means from Iceland to the stars.
Excellent. Well, our next time is going to be in Reykjavik, over the best fish and chip that I've had in my life. And we'll enjoy our time in Iceland. Daniel, it's a pleasure.
An honor. Thank you, Daniel. Bye-bye. Bless.